Hello, everyone. Welcome to World Product Day and our very own special edition of the Black Mirror. I'm Alina, one of the Product Tank organizers in London, and I'll be your host tonight. But before we jump into the amazing talks that we prepared for you, let's go back in time. 10 years ago, when product wasn't really a very defined craft, we were kind of seen as the people who define requirements. Most times, we couldn't even speak to the customer. And the success of our work was measured by the quality of your requirements doc, not solving your customers' problems. That's also when ProductTank was started, by just 25 people at a pub in London, with the sole purpose of connecting product people and allowing them to share and learn from each other. Shortly after, Mind the Product was born, basically to expand into much more than just meetups for product people. And now, 10 years later, we have become the largest product community in the world, with more than 200,000 members in 200 cities around the world. Each of the cities bringing their local communities together with product tanks just like this one tonight. If you are a product person, Mind the Product will give you all the content you probably will ever need. Really useful blogs, there is a global jobs board, or you can even connect with other product people on our own Slack channel. If you have joined already our recently launched membership program, you'll get access to much more premium content and also events with more established product peers. But I guess the core of this is it's your community, and we are always looking for talented people to get involved. So whether you would like to speak at the event, whether you would like to write a blog, or whether you'd like to curate and host an event, please do get in touch with your local coordinators and we will make it happen. Today really is a special day because it is the 10th anniversary of Product Tank. And to celebrate it, we're basically dedicating the whole day, even more than a whole day, 25 hours to product events, 50 live events all across the world. I think right about now, we're kind of midway through. So if you want to basically make an all-night, you definitely can once this is done and join plenty of other events. But hey, enough of history, and let's get back to the present. So tonight's event is Black Mirror 2.0. Last year we had a really successful event, and we thought we would bring you basically a brand new edition. You will ask why? Well, the past few months really have felt like a never-ending Black Mirror episode and have pushed us all outside of our comfort zone. All you hear is pivot, pivot, pivot. It seems to be like a key word right now. So what our speakers will do tonight is confront the new reality and really challenge you to look and think beyond what is actually thought as conventional. If you like what you see and hear, feel free to make some noise. There have been plenty of noise all over social media already today, but do participate using the hashtags World Product Day and Product Tank. Great news is also we're going to have plenty of time to answer your questions. So if you're listening to the talks and you have some things you really burning on your mind that you would like to ask speakers, just pop your question in there and we will get to them once the talks are finished. And now I am super excited to introduce our first speaker of the night. Phil is a product marketing director at the world's largest social listening company, Brandwatch. He specializes in consumer behavior and is the host also of the only consumer psychology podcast called Nudge. On Nudge, Phil basically interviews researchers, authors, and pioneers who study how humans make decisions and distills the interviews into useful advice that any marketeer can use to improve their products. Off to you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Lena. I will share my screen. Hopefully you can all see that. I feel really privileged to be speaking on such a seminal day for Product Tank, and kind of weird as well because it's definitely the most amount of people I've ever spoken to from my sofa before, but those are the times we're living in, I guess. So hello everyone, that was a brilliant introduction from Lena, so I don't have to say much more, but I'm Phil Agnew, Director of Product Marketing at Brandwatch and host of the Nudge podcast. If you want to tweet me at all during this presentation, you can do so by using my Twitter details at @P_Agnew. And today I want to talk about AI. I want to talk about the perception that we have around AI and perhaps a few misconceptions we have as well. And I'm going to target specifically around this sort of conception we've got that AI is evil, that AI might be a little bit evil. And if we were in person, I would be looking around the room at all of you and asking you, raise your hand if you think AI is evil. And I really don't know what I would get. I don't think I would get too many hands raised. But I think you're all a bit biased because you all work in product, and some of you have created AI before, and a lot of you know it quite well. So get a less biased sample to see what the public think. I went to a brilliant website called Answer the Public, and they were able to aggregate all of the Google searches across the web and show the most common questions being asked online. And some of the most common questions being asked online around AI is things like, is it dangerous? One of the most common questions people ask on Google, is AI dangerous? Is AI going to take my job? I think that's a very common question that a lot of people have, a very real question that a lot of people have. And of course, is AI evil? This is a genuine thing. It's a genuine thing that a lot of people search for. And maybe it shouldn't come as a surprise because popular culture is littered with dozens of examples of AI taking over the world with brute force, seducing and outsmarting humans, even beating up our beloved Will Smith. And it's not just science fiction. It's not just this plethora of movies, TV shows, films, but it's also journalists and newspapers as well. They spread genuine fear about AI online. So using a tool called BuzzSumo, which aggregates shared articles across the web, I found the most shared articles around AI. And this is the third most shared article online. And it's from one of the world's most influential people talking about evil AI, talking about AI calling for a ban of these killer AI robots. This isn't a sort of conspiracy from a small publication. This is genuine concern that people have. And it's been shared over 200,000 times as well. And it's not a one-off. Over the course of the last 5 years, this is looking at conversation around articles being shared online that contain the words artificial intelligence and evil. We can see that the amount of articles around people talking about AI being evil online is growing dramatically. In fact, there's been sort of 400,000 articles over the past couple of years. And to help us understand that, to help us get grips of that, I'm gonna introduce to you Tay AI. And Tay AI is Microsoft's sort of go at building a bit of AI on Twitter. And what Tay AI was built to do was to essentially appear human on Twitter. Her goal was to learn and listen to how people spoke online and emulate their responses to essentially sound human. So Tay would analyze every tweet that people sent to her, and she would hopefully engage in casual and friendly discussions with people online. The more people tweeted to Tay, the more accurately human she would look and the more she would learn. Quite exciting, right? Really exciting. One of the first ventures into AI, hopefully engaging lots and lots of people. And on March 23rd, 2016, Tay AI was born. And here's her tweet. She was programmed to look like a bit of a millennial, so kind of showcases classic millennial tweet. Hello, world. And very early on, Tay starts forming opinions. It's really interesting. She's monitoring thousands of opinions online and taking some of the most popular opinions for her own. So here she says that she doesn't really like to drink. Quite an interesting thing for a robot to say. Here she goes on to say that she loved feminism. Again, she's reading all these opinions online, starting to take some of the most popular ones for her own. She even starts to form opinions about politics. And this was pre-election in the US in 2016. And she says, I don't mind Trump, he would get the job done. However, it wasn't long before Tay's views started to become more and more polarized, more and more extreme. She tweets, "We're going to build a wall and Mexico is going to pay for it." Now, this was only 9 hours after her first tweet. In the space of 9 hours, she's read hundreds of comments online and started to pick up some really polarized, quite difficult views. And it gets even worse. She says here that Hitler would have done a better job than the monkey we have now. And you've got to remember that Microsoft built this technology to engage in casual and friendly discussions. She actually goes on to racially abuse some users and even deny the Holocaust. And unsurprisingly, Microsoft saw what was happening and decided to pull the plug. And in under 24 hours, Tay was deleted. Now, Tay AI's story is interesting because it's very different from the rhetoric that we see in movies. Tay AI didn't turn evil to take over the world. She didn't turn evil because of the humans that interacted with her. She did, sorry, turn evil because of the humans that interacted with her. And that begs the question, is Tay evil because of AI? Is AI actually evil? Or actually, could AI only become evil because of the way humans interact with AI? Before we get into that question, let's look at how Tay develops those opinions in the first place. I'll give a quick example of how machine learning and AI sort of works. And I'm not particularly qualified to speak about this, but I've got sort of stolen this example from the brilliant Anthony Goldbloom, who talks about this. And he gives this great example of machine learning and AI being used in how we predict cancer in cells. So diagnosing cancer in cells obviously isn't a very easy job. You have to spot tiny patterns in cells that showcase that cancer is present. If you get it right, it's brilliant, but if you get it wrong, it's obviously potentially deadly. So when a doctor wants to test for cancer, they take a sample and they send it off to a professional, a pathologist. And a pathologist looks at dozens of different samples over the course of a day, hundreds of samples over the course of a month, and thousands of samples over the course of a lifetime. And this is really beneficial because the more and more this person looks at, the better and better they get at making a prediction on whether or not there's cancer in a cell. But the problem is the amount a human pathologist could ever look at, the amount a human could ever remember and refer back to, and the amount of experience they can get really pales in comparison to what a machine can do. So, this is obviously an estimation, but this is what a human can look at over the course of their lifetime, and a machine can look at 10, 20, 30 times that over the course of a minute, and the machine can remember all of those cells intricately and really predict to a very high degree whether one cell is likely to have cancer in it or not. Machines are therefore really good at detecting cancer in cell. In fact, they're almost as good as humans. And in fact, at the moment, we use a combination, or doctors use a combination of machine plus human to detect cancer in cells. So what went wrong with Tay AI? Why does some AI, AI to detect cancer in cells, work so well, doesn't become evil at all, doesn't look to take over the world? Why does that work fine? But why did Tay AI struggle so much? What went wrong with her? Well, the machine works well here. The AI works well because it's answering a simple question, a simple yes, no question. Does this cell contain cancer? Yes or no? And I've got a bunch of really reliable data to go back and look at and see, does that cell contain cancer? Yes, it does. No, it doesn't. It gets really good at making those predictions. Now, problems arise when we use the same techniques for considerably harder questions. So take job interviews. Now, job interviews are very difficult. It's a very difficult decision to make about whether you want to hire somebody or not. And if you were to train AI to hire a job candidate, it would have to answer not one question, is cancer present in the cell, not one question, but dozens of questions. And these questions, the difficulty of these questions is a lot of them don't even have yes or no answers. Is someone a culture fit? It's not really a yes or no answer, it's a complex answer. The real problem for product managers who want to build hiring algorithms in this scenario is there's not a good pool of data to train off. With the pathologist and the cancer prediction, there's a great pool of data, a great plethora of cells that have been correctly tagged as containing cancer or not, but there's not a great pool of data on hiring decisions. And that means it's really difficult to train an AI to make accurate predictions in the future. So Tay AI didn't become evil because it was just evil itself. It became evil because it learned from a poor data set. And the same happens with a lot of other technology. So the question then is, can you trust your data set? And especially if you're like Tay AI, can you trust a data set that relies on human decisions, that relies on human behavior? And I think there's quite a lot of studies, there's quite a lot of psychology that suggests maybe you can't trust humans very well. To help explain this, I'm going to take you all the way back to 1977 to a great study by Darley and Batson. And this study shows how humans with the very best intentions can make bad decisions. And if you try to train AI based off this data, you could struggle. So this study is called the Good Samaritan Study, and it was in a Princeton University in 1977. And the researchers took 55 priests and asked them to perform a sermon at a local church. Now, each priest was asked to perform the sermon at a separate time, so they had no idea that they were in a wider study with 55 different participants. Each priest, before the sermon, met up with the researchers, Darley and Batson, in a nearby office, where they were told to go and give the sermon. And fundamentally here, They were being told to give a sermon on being a good Samaritan. So these are priests, they're pretty good people, and they're also giving a sermon, giving a talk on being a good Samaritan, on being a good person. Now, on the way to the church, they were going to encounter a stranger, and this stranger was calling out for help. They appeared to be injured or homeless in a number of different scenarios, but they were calling out for help. They wanted help from the priest, and they were asking for help directly. And the priests wanted to find how many, the researchers wanted to find how many priests would stop. Obviously, these priests are going to give a talk on a Good Samaritan, so you might expect a high majority of them would stop. Surely the majority, maybe even 100%, would stop. But it's not the case. And interestingly, it changes based on the parameters that are in place. So when Dalian Batson told the priests, walk to the church to give a sermon, and you're early, you've got plenty of time, take your time on the way there, you don't need to rush, 60% of the priests stopped to sort of help this injured person. 60% still not great, is it, for a priest going to give a talk on Good Samaritan? But hey, 60% is not bad. But when they said you're on time, well, then it drops to 40%. So if you say you're on time to give the sermon, then only 40% of them stopped. But interestingly, when they said you were late, the priest was late, only 10% stopped. So what's interesting here is humans who are, perceivably good people doing good things, they changed their decision making based on the sort of the parameters that are fed to them. So good humans can make evil decisions or problematic decisions based on the sort of framework that's been set up. And Tay AI wasn't evil because it felt like being evil. It was evil because it was learning from humans who maybe aren't evil themselves, but were sharing potentially evil views just to see if they could get this thing to act in a certain way. And the problem is, if you're building AI as a product manager, if you're using machine learning algorithms that are based off human decisions, you have to take into account that humans aren't perfectly rational creatures, that we're not all perfect, that we don't always make great decisions, even if we're priests on the way to a church to give a talk on being a good Samaritan. And there's dozens of examples around this, but I'll focus on hiring, which is, I think, really interesting. So this is taken from a great book by Richard Chataway called The Behavior Business. And he cites some brilliant study around hiring. And one of the first is around the decision time it takes for you to make a decision on hiring. And a lot of you listening in will have made a decision on hiring someone in the past, and you'll know that it takes hours of interviews, CV checking, maybe even tasks, hours to really interview someone and get to know them and make an accurate decision. And you might assume that our decision on whether we want to hire someone or not is based on hours of work because it takes so long to interview them. But the reality is that's not the case. In fact, in the majority of research that he cited, that Richard cited, it takes just 20 seconds for us to make a decision on whether we want to hire somebody or not. Within them walking into the room, to sitting down, to sort of answering the first question, it's just 20 seconds. And already we've made an assumption on whether we're going to hire this person or not. And the problem with that is if we take just 20 seconds, we base our decision on a bunch of inherent biases. So, for example, we'll base our decision on things like people with glasses. In research study after study, people with glasses are cited as being more intelligent in an interview, even if they have the exact same skills and experience of somebody who doesn't wear glasses. It gets even worse. So if you've got a Midlands accent in the UK, you're thought as sounding less intelligent as someone who has a Scottish accent. Great news for you Scots, but not great news for you people in the Midlands. You're perceived to be less intelligent if you have that accent. That's a common bias that people have. And a bias that a lot of you will have heard of before is that sort of blind interview study. So when orchestras in the 1970s were asked to conduct rehearsals, when orchestras in the 1970s were asked to conduct auditions behind closed doors, the conductor obviously didn't see the musician playing face to face. The conductor obviously only heard the musician playing music. And what that did is it actually generated or led to 50% more females being hired for a role in an interview. So, showing that there's biases at play there as well. The thing I want to highlight by sharing all these studies is that humans aren't necessarily evil here. I don't think conductors, that hiring managers, that all these people in these studies are evil people. They're just falling foul of biases that all of us have and all of us need to beat. And so the problem is that if AI follows humans blindly, if it takes the data that we create as humans as gospel, then it will reflect our flaws on a mass scale. And hiring is a prime example of this. If an AI algorithm takes previous human hires as a sort of gospel data and trains based off those hires, well, then it will only reflect our worst flaws and our worst biases. And you'll probably end up with an AI machine that looks very evil because it's only hiring white middle class males because it's following the data that it's been fed. It will follow that pattern and only make the problem worse. And it's not just Microsoft and Tay. There are countless of other real examples like this of companies falling foul to bad data. One example is LinkedIn. So if you searched in the past for a female colleague or a female contact on LinkedIn, the website will ask you if you meant to search for a similar looking man's name. So Stephanie Williams was sort of corrected to Stephen Williams. And it wasn't that there weren't, a bunch of results for Stephanie Williams. There were 2,500 results for people with that name, with job titles. With that name on the account. But LinkedIn was forcing you to sort of look at Stephen Williams as well. And it happened with multiple other names. So Andrea Jones, well, that changes to Andrew Jones. Daniela to Daniel, Michaela to Michael, Alexa to Alex. Countless examples. And the problem here was that there were more men on the platform and that men were searched for more. So the algorithm was learning based off that knowledge, that information that it was fed, and predicted that, well, whenever somebody searched for Stephanie, they must really mean Stephen. Pretty evil. But you can see how it's happened because it's following human biases. And it gets worse. So Google's image recognition platform labeled the faces of several black people as gorillas. And the problem here was that AI was trained to recognize humans, but the training data it used was mainly white people. And it started to develop and only classified white people as humans in this scenario. And this looks evil, but again, it's based on the data that was fed to it by humans. And it gets even worse than that. Finally, the last example I'll give is from Cathy O'Neill's brilliant book, Weapons of Math Destruction. And she cites this really incredible product called PredProl. And PredProl was a program which tried to predict where future crimes would occur. And so to better optimize police forces' time, it would try to predict where they would occur. And it sounds great. But in 2017, researchers found that it could get stuck in these negative feedback loops where it would over-police black and brown neighborhoods. And the problem here was that the AI in this platform was learning based off previous crime reports. And of course, more crimes in the past had been recorded in black neighborhoods. And that meant that the program was started to suggest more frequently for the police to patrol in black neighborhoods. And that meant the police spent the majority of their time in those neighborhoods, meaning they only ever recorded crimes in those neighborhoods. And that then fed back in to the program, only encouraging them to spend more and more time in those neighborhoods. And after a while, PredPol would literally only recommend you to go down one street to police one street. AI blindly following humans can become evil, but it doesn't become evil on its own. It only becomes evil because it's fed some sort of nasty data. So how can we, as product marketers and product managers, avoid this? How can we avoid these quite simple errors? And I don't claim to have all the answers here. I more just want to inspire you and share stories that you might be aware of. But I do have a great example of a company that is avoiding these errors. So on my podcast, I spoke to Kate Glazebrook, who founded a brilliant company called Applied. And their goal was to use AI to find great job candidates. But their tech isn't evil. So how did they make an effort to understand humans to create a tech that found great people to hire without creating evil AI? Well, they did it by taking a pretty interesting approach, what I'll call the human-first approach. And the problem is that most other hiring algorithms in the space took a tech-first approach. They looked at the data they could collect, they looked at the technology they could build and went with that. And the problem there is if you feed a hiring algorithm based off historical data, it'll collect our biases and display our biases as we saw in the past. But Applied took a human-first approach. They decided, I don't care about what tech's on the market. I don't care about what tech could potentially predict. First, I want to understand humans. And if I can understand humans, well, then I can build great tech. So they conducted studies to see what the problem was with human hirings. So they found some studies, they did some studies that revealed, for example, that some job descriptions, if they had certain types of words, certain types of language, would be more likely to attract male applicants due to the words they used. So they created technology that highlighted these words, removed them from your job description, and encouraged a more mixed, diverse range of people to apply. They also found that anonymizing CVs could dramatically decrease discrimination in the hiring process. So then they built tech that auto-anonymized CVs. And they found finally that the highest paid person in the room usually ultimately makes a decision on who to hire. It's typical of a lot of companies that I'm sure you work at. But Applied found that this is usually a really bad way of making hiring decisions. In fact, if the highest paid person in the room is making a decision, pretty much 9 times out of 10, they'll make a worse decision than the culminative group. So Applied have created tech that suggests a hire based on the culminative group's decisions rather than one individual person. So importantly here, they were always taking a human-first approach. They were learning from humans first and then building technology that answered these problems. And whenever they created AI to predict potential hires, they wouldn't do that based on unbiased data. They would do that based off data that had been, weighted and looked at and checked for biases first. And if you follow this lead, if you follow this human-led lead, human-first approach, you should hopefully see similar approaches. So you may watch Terminator and assume that all AI must be evil. And you might back this up by reading about a company called Predpol who created AI that encourages police to only sort of monitor black and brown neighborhoods. But it isn't true. I don't think there's such thing as evil AI that wants to take over the world. AI is only as good as the human data it's fed. And as product managers, we have to make a considered effort, not just to understand the tech behind our products, but to also understand the humans behind them as well, and the humans that our AI learns off. And if there's just 2 things you take away from this talk, and it's these 2 things. First is to prioritize things like user testing over technical tests. Don't assume that your user will interact with the product in a certain way. Otherwise, you'll just be assuming that all priests who go to give a sermon on being a good Samaritan will stop and help and be a good Samaritan themselves. Humans don't act that way. So prioritize user testings and don't be surprised when you see humans acting in different ways. And secondly, my urge to all of you would be to prioritize understanding user psychology as well. And the reason I do that is because tech is always going to be changing. So tech between one day and the next will change dramatically. But the brains, our brains, consumers' brains, users' brains won't change at all. It takes millions of years for brains to evolve and change. So if you prioritize learning and understanding how consumers' brains make decisions, then you'll sort of future-proof your career, understand how they interact with certain things, and you'll have rules that you can abide by over the next 70, 80 years, however long your career might be. That is all from me today. I really hope you've enjoyed this talk on why AI perhaps isn't evil. If you're interested in learning more about behavior science and consumer psychology, please do check out my podcast Nudge. You can search for it in any of the podcast players that you may use. And if you do fancy reading a bit more about this topic, I'd suggest 2 brilliant books. So 2 that I referenced earlier. So Weapons of Math Destruction by Cathy O'Neill and The Behavior Business Book by Richard Chataway. 2 brilliant books which highlight some of the problems humans have and how AI can become evil if it's fed the wrong data. All right, that's all from me. Over to Elena.
Great, that was an amazing talk. I'm just going to take a comment from the audience to kind of summarize it, and I quote, fascinating and frightening, but in a good way. Okay, so now moving on. Our second speaker is Mike. He is the CPO at Super Awesome, and he is on a mission to make the internet safer for kids. With previously having worked at Amazon and BBC, Mike now has 18 plus years of experience in media and product that he's using to basically build the kid tech infrastructure that is needed to power the internet for kids. He's really passionate about sharing the best practices for how to design products with both privacy and responsibility at heart, some of which he's going to share right now.
Thank you very much. Hi, I'm Mike, and I'm here to tell you what happens when kids get all up in your product. So I don't have to tell anybody that this is an unprecedented situation. Over half the world's children are now at home, possibly for another 4 months. A couple of years ago, UNICEF reported that 170,000 kids go online for the first time every day. And I think it's a pretty fair bet that that number is accelerating at the moment. not only are more kids using digital products, they are also using them more at the moment, and using more types of products than ever before. Just yesterday, my dad sent a photo of him playing wooden trains with his 4-year-old grandson over an enterprise video conferencing system. So for many of you, kids are all up in your product. And that's a problem for a few reasons. One of the problems is that kids' personal data is like kryptonite to your lawyers. Another is that kids fall into all the sophisticated traps that you built to catch adults, which is going to leave you with some problems. And of course, fines are real and they're increasing. And just in the last 2 weeks, we saw the first fine under GDPR, and it was for misuse of kids' data. So as product people, what should we know and what can we do? Okay, so who am I and why am I qualified to talk about this? So my name's Mike, I'm the Chief Product Officer at Super Awesome. Our mission is to make the internet safer for kids, and in my 4 years at Super Awesome, I've had the pleasure to work on a range of kid tech and kid-facing products and platforms. And so I've had lots of practical experience about trying to understand and navigate the kids' digital privacy landscape and what that means if you're a product person. Super Awesome's the #1 kid tech company in the world. We've got about 160 people completely focused on these issues. And so a lot of this best practice comes from working on lots of real world situations with brands and developers the world over. So what do we need to know? Well, firstly, we need to know a little bit about kids' data privacy, the global legislations, and how to be compliant in practice when we're thinking about building our products. And secondly, we need to think about responsible design for kids and make sure that we're designing with kids in mind. Just a quick sidebar, I'm going to use the word kids a lot in the next 15 minutes. Because I've only got 15 minutes, I can only skim over all of the depth of this topic. And one thing that I'm going to skim over is the fact that kids come in lots of different ages, and the practical kind of best practices and things that you should do definitely significantly vary by age. So for the purposes of this talk, imagine me age 7 when I talk about a kid. That's kind of what I'm talking about. If you're thinking about a teen, some of this stuff softens up and changes a little bit. If you're talking about younger tiddlers and toddlers, then some of this stuff is going to be either harder or much more directly managed by the parent. If you do want to learn about how to design with the different developmental stages of kids in mind, I'd really recommend this book for product and UX people. It's a super good primer. So what do we need to know about kids' data privacy? Well, the first thing is that all of these blue countries have got some live kids' data privacy legislation that you need to know about as product people. The purple ones are currently working on something, and the dark grey ones are talking about stuff. So if you're like me, the blue colours probably represent a large portion of where you're operating in as a product person. So you need to know about this stuff. And when we talk about kids' data privacy, what we really mean is personal data. And for kids, what personal data means is the obvious stuff, like address, full name, telephone number, some kind of national identity number. Also online contact information, email address is kind of obvious, but also social media handles, they count as online contact information. Then there's the less obvious stuff, like persistent identifiers over time, such as cookies. Also photos, voice recordings, or videos, those are also personal data. They contain a personal representation of the kid. And maybe obvious when you think about it, but a user's location, either their current location or a history of where they've been. Least obvious is that actually anything that links these data points together also counts as personal data. So if you think about the kind of technology that is tracking you across different devices and browsers to try and chase you around with advertising, that sort of probabilistic fingerprint that's linking data points together, that is also considered personal data because it's trying to uniquely identify an individual. And when that comes to a kid, that's going to count. So the basics of how to be compliant with kids' data privacy globally are pretty simple. Number one, privacy by default. So where possible, we want to be collecting no data from kids, and we want to be making sure that we're building our products and services in a zero data way. If we think that we've got kids in our product, if we think there's any chance of having a mixed audience. So starting with privacy by default, the other basic is really if your product collects personal data from a child, then you must get their parents' consent to collect that data. And I'm going to go into a bit more about what parent consent means and how to go about getting it. But that's the basics. So what do we need to know about responsible design for kids? Well, I'm going to lay out a few best practices for you, and I'm going to bring each of them to life with what I hope is a practical use case that you probably have in your product. So the first thing that we can do as product people is just to acknowledge that kids exist. And we can start by doing this in our privacy policy or in our data protection impact assessment. And that's making a good start. That shows that we're thinking about this stuff and that matters to the regulators should they come calling. But also we should acknowledge kids in our onboarding. So if you've a consumer-facing experience and you think there's any chance that you have a somewhat mixed audience of kids and grown-ups, then do present an age gate and ask the kids to declare themselves as kids. Obviously, this is far from perfect, but it's the main solution that we have at the moment. When you present that age gate, don't guide the user to lie about their age. Don't make it clear that there are cool features that are locked behind choosing the wrong answer to that question. If you have a sign-up flow, then don't ask for more information than you need. I mean, this is good practice regardless for any user, but you might be tempted to collect things like first and last name or some kind of contact information. And if you're dealing with a mixed audience that might contain kids, then the best practice is to just not collect that up front. And if you need to collect it to power some feature or functionality later down the line, then collect it at the point where it matters to the experience. And finally, if you have used an age gate and you think you're dealing with a kid, then do give kids the facts about your privacy policy in simple terms, and then maybe invite them to get their parents to read the detail of it. And I think in this situation, this is one of the few cases where a hello fellow kids editorial strategy is kind of acceptable. So we're looking to present simple, understandable language that just covers the basics of what kids need to know about what you are going to do with their data and why. So we've acknowledged kids exist. The next thing is that we want to give kids access responsibly. Before lockdown started, I went to the pub with some work friends, and there was a family there. I think they were on holiday. There was a mum and a dad and a young boy on his dad's shoulders. They were laughing and joking around. Everyone was having a super good time. And that kid was able to enjoy everything about that experience of being in this London pub with a vibey social atmosphere, chatting and laughing and joking. But presumably, if he went to the bar to try and buy some alcohol, that's when the protections would kick in, and we would have some protections for that kid. And I do think that that's a good model for the kids' internet in general, which is that we should be looking not to lock kids off from spaces online, but to give them everything that's possible to give them, and just making sure that we protect them when we need to. So a good example of this in practical terms is user-generated content, which you might have in your product. So don't offer UGC functionality to kids without moderation, and do use some combination of technical and human moderation, so that we can create a safe and appropriate space for kids. This is my absolute favorite example from the moderation platform that sits behind our PopJam app. Here you can actually see moderation technology creating a better and calmer online system. The red lines here never got displayed to anyone. So we already discovered that images and videos of kids count as personal information. So if you want to allow kids to share selfies or videos of themselves, then you're going to need to ask for parental consent before you do that. I'm going to go into a bit more detail on parental consent in a moment. And unless you really know what you're doing, I think a general best practice is to not provide private chat to kids. By providing closed social spaces, we have to be utterly certain that all the participants in that social space are who they say they are. So particularly when you're dealing with younger audiences, I'm just going to say that again, don't provide private chats to kids. So don't track kids across products. This is most easily illustrated by the advertising use case. So if you're funding your product with advertising, then don't permit behaviorally targeted advertising if you think you're dealing with a kid, or if you think you have an audience that's predominantly kids. You want to only use contextual advertising. And you do want to use zero data monetization platforms, ones that aren't collecting a set of personal and various data points as the kid is using your product. As I work for Super Awesome, I'm duty bound to tell you that we have the only zero data ad platform built from the ground up for the needs of the kids' digital ecosystem. And if you put your age gate in, then that's a way that you can switch to the appropriate ad technology. So if you know you're dealing with a grown-up, then you can switch to the adult ad stack, use behaviorally targeted advertising, go on the open market. Otherwise, use contextual zero data ad platforms if you're dealing with a kid. And this isn't just best practice because I say it is. You can see in the App Store guidelines, for example, that contextual advertising is the way to go for kids. So I've mentioned a couple of times already, do involve a parent when needed. So let's look at a couple of use cases about when you might get a parent involved and how. And the differences between these two are really the sensitivity of the data that we're potentially collecting. So you might have push notifications in your product. And if you offer push notifications to your users, then you must notify the parent if a kid enables them. So you can allow the kids to turn the feature on. And if they do, you need to then ask them for a method to contact their parents. Asking them for a parent's email address is probably the simplest way of doing that. Send a notice to the parent and giving them an explanation of what's going on, and also an option to opt out. And so that's called opt out parental consent, because the data point that we're dealing with is reasonably low risk. If we're dealing with something more sensitive, for example, a kid's ever updating geolocation, then we need to behave slightly differently. So the responsible way of dealing with a feature that requires a user's location is you must get the parent's consent before their child enables the feature. So when the kid goes to use or activate the feature that needs it, you're going to need to ask them for a way to contact the parent. Again, an email address is the easiest way to do that. And send a message to the parents to explain the awesome feature that the kid is trying to enable, and why you are a developer that cares very much about kids' data privacy and is taking all of the requisite precautions, and then give them a way to grant that consent. So this is called opt-in parental consent. And if that sounds a little bit hairy, it can be. And so solutions and platforms exist out there to sort of solve this problem for you. As I work for Super Awesome, I'm duty bound to tell you that we have a platform called Kids Web Services that will solve this consent management platform for you out of the box. As I've thrown all of these things at you, it might feel like building products with kids in mind gets kind of complicated and difficult. And I suppose if I'm going to leave you with anything, it's that I really believe that we shouldn't be limited in our imagination by data privacy rules. If we need kids' personal data in order to provide to them the best digital experiences, then we should just get parental consent and then give kids the awesome experiences that they deserve. So what next? Well, I hope with this very brief primer that you will go and design with kids in mind. If you want to know more and get into a bit more of the detail here, you can go to kidaware.com, which is a e-learning portal and certification that you can get a bit deeper into the different global legislations and the best practices. And if, like me, you feel like we really should be doing a better job as product people building the next generation of products with kids in mind, then I urge you to take a look at the Kid Tech Standard and consider supporting it. It's a set of principles and best practices for developing safe and responsible digital products for kids. So that's what you do when you believe that you have kids all up in your products. You are looking to build products that have privacy by default and parental consent for everything else. Thanks very much.
Amazing. Thanks, Mike. Times like these, I really miss being in Conway Hall, because I would love to see how many people are scratching heads now and thinking, should I? Shouldn't I? Yes, great talk. And now on to our final speaker of the night. Last but not least, we have Eli. Eli is currently a product leader and head of UX design at Kazoo. He basically helps companies find their customers, meet the customers' needs, and build viable products. He's previously worked with companies like AT&T, Amazon, and Pivotal to advance their design, data science, and product practices. Eli also advocates for diversity in tech organizations and helps companies apply user-centered design not only to products, but also to internal processes and hiring. Over to you.
Cool. Hey, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Tonight, I want to talk to you about moving beyond human-centered design and unfucking the world by using a bigger lens. So let's get right into it. So tonight's talk, the theme is Black Mirror, and as lots of you are watching this on your computer or phone screens, I wanted to just pause here and take a moment and talk about the world as is. You know, we are living in a time of what feels like dystopia. People, you know, out on the streets wearing masks, some people driving to castles in the middle of the night for no reason. Other people, you know, breaking laws and getting away with it. And it can feel really stressful and overwhelming. And it can be a very stressful time. And hopefully this talk comes from a place of a little bit of anger, but maybe a little bit of hope too. And I sincerely hope that each of you walks away with a little something and remembers that, you know, even if we are looking in the Black Mirror, you're not alone. One of the things that I think is really important to recognize just right off the bat is that the world isn't necessarily broken. It's working exactly as it was designed to work, and we're the ones who designed it. Mike Monteiro has written a great book called Ruined by Design that you can now get in hardcover, and that is probably not the only product placement I'll be doing tonight, but Mike's book is great. You should definitely read it. Please do. But what does this mean? What is the world isn't broken and it's working as it was designed to work really look like in practice? I think when we start to think about human-centered design, we've been told that the pinnacle of human-centered design is this, right? Start with a foundation that's usable, then make it useful, then escalate to desirable, and then delightful and meaningful. And while I think that those are all really good quality outcomes for good and successful design, I think that they can kind of have some limits and introduce biases into the way that we think about building products. And what you get at every level is you get some of these problems that can come from designing specifically for behavior. And, you know, psychology is a powerful tool, but abused, usability can make us thoughtless, right? Some research has shown that when we do the thinking for users or we make applications seem smart, people kind of turn off their brains. And that's all in the slides, and I don't have like a whole lot of time to get into all the details of the research, but I did put together a really good Notion page that has a ton of notes and information, and you can check out my slides and see all the notes I've put together. But, you know, useful products or convenient products can sometimes make us wasteful. Desirable products can be addictive, right? Delightful products can make us frivolous. And depending on where you're getting your meaning in life, a meaningful product can make you self-centered. Looking at you, Instagram. So how do we deal with this and actually move on and like design better products? You know, I think in the last decade, we've seen things that, you know, human-centered design has really taken over the world. And, you know, this is kind of the heyday of human-centered design, but human-centered design isn't necessarily new, right? We've been doing human-centered design in the design of the automobile and cities and cars and everything else, right? And like industrialization introduced both this mechanical worldview and made human-centered design a lot more scalable. And while I think human-centered design is new to building software, it's not necessarily a new philosophy. It's not necessarily a new worldview. And I don't think it's a very sustainable one. So, you know, we've been told that design and like the apex of design is to design for Mary, right? And persona, have a persona, have somebody that you're designing for. If you've never seen one of these, this is a persona. And what it tends to do is be a snapshot of a person's life at a moment when they engage with a product. And, you know, this is a low fidelity proto persona. So it's something that you would typically go and validate. But the problem with this persona is that it's a snapshot. It doesn't necessarily account for Mary's family. You know, it says that Mary is married with 2 kids, but we're not really sure who those kids are, what their lives are like, what Mary's like life is really like. And we kind of have to go a little deeper if we're going to really build products that, 1, are good for people, and 2, really balance their needs. So in thinking about Mary, I think we need to move beyond just looking at transactions with Mary as the most important thing. And we need to really dig into like what's beyond just the persona. How do we start to think outside this one individual user? You know, when ProductTank was founded 10 years ago, the very next summer, Mark Andreessen would write his very now famous article about how software is eating the world. And I think the difference between 10 years ago and now is that today, software is the world, right? Software is everything that we do, everything that we're powered by. You know, we still call these devices that we have phones, but they're really mobile computers more than anything else. And as much as the moniker doesn't fit, we still call them phones because they can make phone calls. But you know, everything is powered by software, from the networks to payments to this product stream. And, you know, not only is it software, it's connected, right? And so the world is much more connected than it used to be 10 years ago, in a way that I think a little bit of foresight from Andreessen was like definitely there, but software is the world. And that means that our responsibility as product managers is only bigger than it used to be. And when we look at the top 10 companies in the world by market cap, 7 of them are tech companies. And when we start to think about what that means for the world at large, you know, I think that we need to recognize that the patterns of software that have been introduced by building everything in software, you know, things are interconnected, modular, and scalable. You can kind of see that in human behavior too, right? Like the average millennial checks their phone 157 times per day. And, you know, we're in a place where like, not only are those systems happening on the micro level of like people being obsessed with their phones and checking them hundreds of times a day, we're in a place where the systems that we've designed have kind of run away from our hands. You know, the inmates are running the asylum, if you will. And here's a recent headline that really grabbed my attention as I was doing research for this talk, because what we have right now is we have a system in which, because of quality SLAs, airlines are running empty flights to and from places for the purpose of maintaining their slots and their standard of service. And that's a big picture, like macro system that's been designed with no regard to failure or the environment, and has not really considered like maybe pausing or taking a deep breath and like not running those planes, you know, and the regulations haven't flexed. So this is happening every single day. And we're in a place where the systems that we've designed are now designing us. You know, when a system kind of takes on a life of its own, it can have dire consequences. And I think that we've seen that in the way that democracy, free speech, and questions of misinformation have kind of run away on a socialized internet, right? On an internet that is more social and at the same time more filled with echo chambers. And so we are being designed by the systems that we've put in place, whether they're private systems or public systems, whether they're applications or media. Like, we have this kind of self-perpetuating cycle. I saw a stat today that said, a recent survey that said that only about 50% of Americans would even opt in for a COVID-19 vaccine if it was available. And that's kind of scary. But if we think about how to move forward and make progress, I think we need to look beyond human-centered design. You know, all the examples I've shared with you so far are things that have gotten out of our control because we put humans at the crux and at the center of our design process rather than taking a bigger picture and using a bigger lens. And so in this next section, I want to talk to you about 4 principles of human-centered design and how we can move beyond human-centered design. One of the big inspirations that I have is Dan Barber, who is a farm-to-table chef in New York. He runs Blue Hill Farms, which is a farm-to-table restaurant. And Dan has actually taken on this challenge of human-centered design and started to design food for flavor. And if you've never heard of Dan or you are interested in learning more, you can check out the episode featuring him on Netflix's Chef's Table. I pull lots of sources because I like watching stuff. But this episode really sat with me. And the reason it did is because farm-to-table restaurateuring is a lot like building a product, because you have to care about the ingredients. And in the same way, I think as product people in the next decade, we could really start to care a lot more about our ingredients and the systems that power those ingredients. You know, what is the data that we need? Where does it come from? How do we use it? And so on. So I think we need to just be a little bit more mindful, a lot more mindful, if we're going to make progress in the next decade of product management. So here are 4 quick principles that I want to talk you through so that we can get to a good place. And I would love to take some questions after the talk. So principle 1, uncover systems and impacts. We, like I was saying, can no longer measure product success at the individual level. We have to look beyond the one individual transaction or that one email or, you know, that just conversion rate metric, right? Because when you start to think about like product success for Uber, for example, they are in a place where they're measuring, you know, rides per day as a metric of product success. And as you start to look at that and see what's really happening, you're getting a ride, but you're also increasing the carbon footprint of your city and yourself by about 69%, right? And so what a study has found is that Uber and Lyft operating in cities has actually increased the carbon footprint compared to the taxi services that they were designed to replace, because those drivers are idling, the riders are taking shorter rides rather than longer rides. And I think it's something like over half of all Uber rides happen within a 3-mile distance, something that could easily be walked in most cities. So it's not necessarily that people are bad, but we've designed a product for convenience that has put humans at the center, and that convenience is coming at a cost to the environment. When you think about email, in particular, you might be thinking, what's email got to do with it? Like, you know, that's pretty clean tech. It's just in a data center, and you might never even think about email. But did you know that if you were to send one less wasteful email per day, the carbon footprint of that, if everyone in the UK were to do it, would be 81,000 flights from London to either Barcelona or Madrid. 81,000 flights. And that's just one email. If each of us sent one less wasteful email per day. And when you start to think about that on a global scale, it's kind of mind-boggling how these very, very small decisions have very, very big impacts. And does that mean that you should never send an email? No, but it does mean that we could be more mindful. Also, if you archive tons of stuff, just delete it instead. It's actually better for the environment. So how do you start to like make these connections and understand all this? Service blueprinting and journey maps are two tools that you can use to really dig into systems and uncover them. And there's a ton more on that in the resource guide that I put together on Notion that I've already tweeted out. And while I was doing some research for this project, or for this talk, I came across two new tools that I hadn't really used in a whole lot of depth before. So you'll find some resources for this too, but there's the rich picture method, which is a service design tool that looks at all the people involved in making a service, a system, or a product happen. And then looking at the 5 W's of a product. So why, what, where, when, who, and then how. So how you can use these tools is to look at the broader context of the product and service that you're designing and help people make good decisions by thinking a little bit more holistically about what you're up to. The next principle is to reframe where you measure value. And I think that the reason this is so important is because you can end up in an unexpectedly bad place, either as a product or as a service, by not considering what's really important when it comes to where you measure value. And it's not just a moral crisis, right? This isn't just like some boo-hooing for the sake of like, oh, this is environmentalism disguised as a product talk. No, it can be really bad business to do this. There was a recent article on Substack that I'm sure Martin or somebody else will tweet out in a bit called Pizza Arbitrage. And it's one of the finest pieces of financial writing that's ever happened in the history of the internet. But basically, DoorDash will, when they're moving into an area, set up a virtual restaurant and sell those at a price that's lower than the established restaurants. So a pizza shop owner found that he could make money by buying his own pizzas off DoorDash. So the price difference was about $8. DoorDash was undercutting his own price by $8. So he was selling pizzas for 24 and DoorDash was selling them for 16. Well, he found a way to kind of like turn the system against itself and make profit on those pizzas. And it's a really good article that you should check out. But the problem with this is we have all this capital kind of floating around in these markets and there's no profit, right? And the problem with that is everyone loses. The driver loses, the recipient, the customer loses, the restaurant loses, because the capital that is being transacted has to come from somewhere, and it's coming from workers' wages and it's coming from restaurant profits. And so this tech company in the middle is trying to squeeze both ends of that. And there's not a whole lot of juice to squeeze. And that might seem like, oh, well, like, what am I supposed to do? I'm just a product manager on the front lines. And I think that's where principle 3 comes in. Focus on what you can control. When it comes to systems, you might not be able to control everything, but you can probably control who knows what and what you know. And that's a really important thing to do, is just like focus on how you share information. What is your vision? How do you share when you learn about an adverse impact that your product has, and how do you empower people to then take control with your influence? How do you help people learn about the secondary impacts of your products and which actions they can take in response? How do you help people understand that their actions can actually make a difference, right? And then when you're thinking about broader industry level changes or global changes and structural and societal issues, that's certainly in your circle of concern. You can't control all that, but you can put some plans together to have a bigger impact. And then finally, take regenerative action. And I think that this is so important because here's an example. If we were to think about every street lamp in the entire United Kingdom, right? Every street lamp. Did you know that the excess energy that is wasted every single day boiling water for tea could power all those street lamps for a night? And what I mean is 65% of people in a survey reported overfilling their kettles when they need just 1 cup of tea. And if we were to take just that energy, we could power every street lamp in the UK for a night. So the thing is the decisions that we're making as product people, they do have an impact. And the next decade of product demands better from us. So here's a couple of examples of what I'm talking about. here's a kettle that has a 1 cup minimum, right? So it's very easy to see how much water you should actually put in for what you actually need. And that's a very small graphic change, but it can help make a big, big difference to the way that people think about the energy that they're using and the way that they engage with the product that they're going to be using to make some tea with, for example. And, you know, when we're thinking about that interaction, right, that's just a kettle, but it's a kettle that is an interface, which has a location, which is part of a journey, which is part of some structure, which is part of a system, aka a power grid, and also somebody's home, which is part of an ecosystem, which is our environment. And everything is connected, and we want to make sure to think about all those things. And I think that the next decade of product management is really about starting to focus on those bigger questions and those bigger picture issues, and thinking about our products in the broader situations that they live in. And finally, I want to leave you with a challenge for the next decade of product management. If we've started with usable, useful, desirable, delightful, and meaningful as where we could build products, I would like us to think about the next decade of product management and building products as starting from a foundation of responsibility and building on that to be equitable, empowering, sustainable, and ultimately regenerative. And I think that if we can get behind this, and if we can think about society-centered design and the broader ecological impacts of the decisions that we're making, not just, you know, environmental impacts, but like human systems and everything else, we can do a lot more for ourselves, for the environment, and for business. So that's it. Say hi to me at Intentionaut. I've got a Notion page which has a ton more. And if you want to see some books that I use to inspire this talk, these are some of the books that I love to read, love to recommend, and would encourage you to pick up. And those will all be in my slide deck too. So thank you so much. If you liked or hated this talk, follow me on Twitter and let me know. Cool.
Nice. What a great ending to the evening. I guess now is, thank you everybody for your talks. I guess now it's time to start a good debate and answer some questions. I think audience needs to get their fears going. While we wait for some more questions to roll in, I'll just ask a more general one. Obviously, with the recent Black Mirror Neverending episode and COVID-19, we're seeing a lot of changes where people are becoming more aware of sustainability. We're seeing, you know, like we're seeing those blue skies, we're seeing those mountains. Right now, everybody's super committed. The kids are up in your products. But my question to you is, how do you think the world will change afterwards? Is this just a phase, or do you think those kind of trends will continue after we're out of the episode, so to speak?
Great question, Alina. It's almost too difficult for anyone to ask. I'll start. I think, I think it's really tough to predict because nothing like this has ever happened before, right? So there's no historical data we can refer back to and say, oh, this was the trend afterwards. This is the trend we can refer back to. So I think it's a tough one to answer. I think from a personal point of view, in terms of what I feel I've seen change, I think us three spoke about sort of changes that we were noticing in sort of the companies we worked at before the show. In terms of sustainability, I think it'd be crazy if a lot of people didn't reconsider the value of city living and the importance of living in a city versus living somewhere else. There's a lot of costs that come attached to living to a city, so general cost of rent and lack of space, and even stuff like time spent commuting, and all of that has a compounding cost on humans. There's a great study by Daniel Kahneman which looked at all of the major things people do in their lives and ranked them and asked, oh, how happy are you in general? And they compare them to these major things that people do. And turns out, other than being cheated on by your partner, the number one thing that indicated unhappiness was commuting time. So I think if we could get rid of that, I mean, that would be a big benefit for people. So I can see some changes happening, but a lot of it will depend on whether people see this as sort of a weird one-off event, with not much to learn, or perhaps a chance to move into a different sort of way of living.
From the point of view of a product person, I feel like there's an acceleration of some sort of changes that were already happening in terms of adoption of certain technologies, adoption of kind of ways of interacting, that just feels really accelerated at the moment. And so I think that one of the impacts is going to be coming out of this situation is going to be that interactions, like, for example, speaking to your GP, like having a telephone consultation, like these kinds of remote and digital activities, I think are just like stunningly transformed in what was probably going to take another sort of 5 to 10 years. Everyone's just been like, oh, okay, so now we do remote GP consultations and that's totally fine. Which obviously, as a digital product manager, that's kind of an exciting turn of events. And as somebody that's like looking ahead to where things are going with regards to kids on the internet, I also feel like it's just adding pressure and transformation that's kind of going to drive adoption of the kinds of products that we want to build, and force us to ask some questions about some of the assumptions that we've had about those kinds of interactions.
I think predictions are really hard, especially when you're dealing with lots of unknown and uncertainty. I think we'll see a range of behaviors, kind of like what we're seeing in the political sphere, where certain things feel like they've advanced, certain things feel like they've regressed, and there's a mix of opinions. And where that's distributed, it's hard to say. You know, I think William Gibson has a really great quote about this, which is, the future is already among us, it's just unevenly distributed. And I think that the things to be watching for in this moment are, you know, who is spending money where, and what are we seeing kind of in the real estate market, especially with commercial real estate, but what knock-on effects does that have? And kind of paying attention to systems and ecosystems of human living and human habitation, I think, is the thing to start watching. You know, if 18 months from now we start seeing offices shut down, that would have a knock-on impact on residential living, as well as small businesses, as well as like all sorts of things, right? So I think it's just watching those systems for the indicators, because it's probably too early to tell.
Totally makes sense. Another question might be more for Phil, I guess. You kind of touched on human biases, and that they're the ones to blame for AI going evil. So when you're building products, and even outside of building product, I remember seeing that there were 400 different types of biases. So how do you identify them and account for them when you actually are building products to make sure they don't hit you?
It's a great question. So yeah, I think there are so many biases because there are all these professors that are desperate to have a bias named after them, so they just keep coming up with new ones and new ones and new ones, so they can get their own Wikipedia article. But there are a lot. I think it's overwhelming to think of them all and try to understand them all. There are great resources you can go to learn more about specific ones, but the most important thing is to get a basic understanding of, first of all, that humans are just irrational. So get your basic sort of understanding that humans do not make rational decisions by default. 10, 20 years ago, there was this view that sort of economists held, which was that humans had perfect rationality, that they would only make decisions that benefited them. Yet there are dozens of examples that show that isn't the case. People don't save enough in the US, so they end up going bankrupt. People in the UK don't pay their parking tickets on time, which mean they end up getting bigger and bigger fines. So if you set up with the mindset that humans are irrational, you'll go a long way. And I think the next best thing to learn is around how humans make decisions. And for that, I always reference Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, where he introduced the two modes for humans making decisions. System 1, which is how we make 98% of our decisions. It's that automatic, very bias-led, heuristic way of making decisions. We lean on shortcuts and we'll always, if you're a marketer or web designer, you'll always click on the first link on the page. You'll always click on something that's colorful, that sort of thing. And then that second way of making decisions, which is system 2, which is more considered, slower. About 2% of our decisions are made there. So if you can keep that framework in mind, that in general humans are going to be led to biases, that they're going to be irrational, that they won't make rational decisions, then you should constantly be testing your product to see if it falls foul of those biases. And sort of that's why I was really pushing at the end of the talk to prioritize user testing and understanding user psychology. I wouldn't ever suggest learning all 400 biases. I would definitely suggest getting the foundation right. So really trying to understand the irrationality that we have when we make decisions, and then testing for that as well.
Totally non-systematic, but my old boss created a set of flashcards for an exercise that we were running once, which I still have gripped with a bulldog clip, which I printed out and cut up. And just having those flashcards so that you can just sort of dip into them and shuffle them around and draw some things out, and you'll look at a bias or a piece of psychology, and you just ask some questions about the current product problem that you're working on. And it's totally non-systematic, but it just gives you that sense of like, okay, let me dip back into this store of things that I sometimes need to examine, and just use those flashcards as a way of triggering debate and asking questions inside the team.
I think I remember those, Mike. That's mental notes, isn't it? The flashcards. Is that what they're called? Yeah, very well.
He just like synthesized a bunch of books into a PowerPoint presentation. I printed them out and cut them up. So
nice.
Great.
I think one of the tools I use is something that was talked about in last Black Mirror last year. Roshi Proven's the abusability test, the Black Mirror test, right? Of like, how could this feature, this thing that we're doing, this data be abused, and under what circumstances? And, you know, talking about abuser stories or abusability cases, and really thinking about what are the ways in which somebody could weaponize this, you know. In my own talking and thinking with a friend of mine, we used to ask, instead of what would Jesus do, what would 4chan do, right? And so thinking about like, what could the worst possible people on the internet do with this power or this tool or this product if they came across it, and how do we prevent that? So thinking about somebody who, you know, is using your product, if you work in home automation or smart home technology, like what happens when people break up and one of the partners is abusive, and how do you basically create like kill switches or protocols that lock people out to prevent abuse cases, right? And thinking about like, what is something that people could do if they had bad intents is a really good place to start.
Mm-hmm. And also, we had a question from Joy, who basically asked Mike on what are the kind of legal ages where for kids where you need to ask their parents' consent. And then kind of like the follow-up was, I want to make it legal, but I also want to make it ethical. So how do you balance between both, and how do you evaluate what should be legal and what should be ethical choices?
So, I mean, the practical answer to the first half is it depends on the countries you're operating in, and the legislation is kind of a little bit fractured and spread out between 13 and 16. I think that the question of what's legal and what's responsible is pleasingly sort of dovetailing at the moment, and the age-appropriate design code that the UK put out recently, I think, is a really nice example of taking what is essentially a legal framework, but then positioning it in terms of like, how do you deal with these things in practical, responsible ways? So yes, we definitely should be legal, and yes, we should be striving to be as ethical as we can. And actually, I think the guidance is bringing those two things together in quite practical ways for product makers at the moment. So if people have any interest in age-appropriate design, then it's actually a pretty readable document as these things go, and I would urge people to Google it and check it out.
Nice. And then Eli, one for you. So, you know, like there's the traditional way of building around your personas, and you might already have an established product and established personas, and kind of everything is going well, and now they've listened to your talk and they go away feeling like they want to change the world. How do you step away from already something so established, and, you know, kind of like linking it back to your circles of influence? How can you change your whole product and your whole company if you can only do it within your little circle?
I think creating a shared understanding of the problem is always step one, right? If you're the only one who sees the problem, then you have to see who else believes that that might be a problem, right? So if you notice something, say something. And work with people who, you know, are in your area, in your field, and go, hey, this seems like a problem. Does that seem like a problem to you? And push it, right? And I am very comfortable asking very uncomfortable questions. And that's a skill that takes time and effort to build, right? But like, I like to think very practically about, okay, am I the only one who sees this, or do I have other people who see this too? And then if I think it's a problem and other people do too, what can we do about it? And I think that that's always the very first place to start. But if that doesn't feel concrete enough, check out my Notion page, go to my Twitter account. I put actually what's called an actant persona in the resource page on Notion, which is a way of designing non-human personas and non-human stakeholders into your product considerations. And you might not do everything all at once, right? Like you're probably not going to reinvent your established product to do this, but you can do a couple things. You can do better next time. You can choose to do better now and consider it moving forward, or you can do one thing better, right? Like there's always ways to slice that problem and just choose something that you could do to be better, right? If you think that your product is hoovering up too much data, you can always just say, you know what? We're going to try to use less data or use data more meaningfully moving forward. Or we're going to, you know, try to be a little bit more privacy conscious, or we're going to try to be more responsible with, you know, the desirability of this product, because yes, our numbers go up, but people gamble away their life savings, or, you know, people's kids spent their entire paycheck on our games, you know, and like that can be a problem, and you want to consider those things. And if you check out the Notion page, there's a ton of resources and some books in there.
Great. Well, thanks, guys. It has been a pleasure to have you today. It has been great working with you. And thank you to all the audience who took their time and listened to us tonight. Keep it going. There's still plenty of product tanks happening, so keep it going. Thanks, everyone.
Cool. Thanks.
Goodbye.
Thanks so much.